It's time for everyone's favorite GMAT Club game show. Guess where they got in? Do, 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 do. I'm your host, Maria Wigvila. Nice to meet you. A quick introduction to me if you've never heard of me before. I'm a 2005 graduate of Harvard Business School, and I'm the founder of ApplicantLab.com, which is the admissions service that is disrupting the highly expensive and overpriced admissions consulting industry. You don't need to pay thousands of dollars for great advice because Applicant Lab is there to guide you instead. So let's review today's profile. Uh, First of all, Indian male engineer. Shocking, right? There are so few of them in the applicant pool. Just kidding. There are a bazillion Indian engineers and Indian male engineers in particular in the applicant pool. So right off the bat, that's not great, right? If you're in any sort of overrepresented group, realize that you are going to have that much harder of a time standing out when you are being compared against your peers. So yeah, that's not great. But hey, a little good news. This person went to one of the IITs, which hey is good, right? Because that's a hard college to get into, and so it signifies a certain level of academic ability. But there are also thousands, I think, of IIT graduates each year. So that by itself, it's not like IIT only graduates 10 people per year, and these are the 10 smartest people in India, right? I mean, there's a lot of IIT graduates. Um, so this person had a GMAT score that was above a 750 or above. Um, so I will say that if you are from any overrepresented group, you don't have to have a 750 plus. It is not a requirement. It is obviously not mandatory. If you saw my last video on an engineer who got into Stanford, an Indian engineer who got into Stanford, that person's GMAT score was considerably below a 750, right? So it's certainly not mandatory to have a 750 plus if you're from an overrepresented group. It just makes things that much easier, right? And part of the reason for this is that in the publicly published statistics that GMAC releases about GMAT test takers from around the world, they actually, you can hunt down this report and look at it. It's pretty interesting. They actually take all of the test takers from each country and they do a report where they tell you what the average score per country is, right? So I believe that I looked at this report a year or so ago, and it's been pretty consistent for the past several years. Test takers from India tend to score about 30 points higher than test takers from the US. And there are a number of reasons for this. I think a big one really is that the educational system in India is really, really focused on test taking from a very young age, versus in the US, like, you take the SAT test once, your senior year of high school, and then you don't really have to take any tests again until the GMAT, right? So it's not, I mean, obviously your school has tests, but I mean, for the purposes of admissions, it's not like your whole life really depends upon testing. And so it's not sort of as ingrained into American brains as it is for people from other countries with slightly different educational systems. So, what was the work experience? Well, this person was working for a manufacturing company, like on sort of the manufacturing factory side of a company that was in the sort of, let's call it snack food beverage type of space. So there are a number of conglomerates in the world who specialize in two, or in some cases three, of these. There are snack and beverage companies, there are food and beverage companies, there are beverage and snack companies. I might have already said that one. Anyway, so it's not uncommon for large international conglomerates to have sort of a portfolio of different offerings. And one of the things that was sort of extraordinary about this person is that as part of their career, they were offered an opportunity to go to help do some sort of optimization, or I don't know, something like that, at a factory. But it was a factory in a country that doesn't speak English, and is in fact a country that is pretty hostile to foreigners. So let's say, I'm not saying this is what the country was, it may be, it may not be, but let's just say for the purpose of illustration that the country was France, right? I don't know if you've ever been to France and if you've ever had the unique delight of having a Parisiens look down at you as you try to speak in French, and oh la la, they are sacre bleu, they are so disgusted at your terrible accent. Anyway, suffice it to say, I'm sure French people are lovely, but they're a little on the grumpy side, right? If you've ever been to France, not exactly huge, warm, embracing those of embracing people who don't speak French. So what this person did was, they could have just said, "Look, I'm just here to run some numbers and do some analyses, and I'm not going to engage with any of you. You all don't want to speak to me in English, whatever. Like, I'm just going to do my job and get out of here." But that's not what this candidate did. This candidate actually viewed this as an opportunity on a couple of different levels. So number one, the candidate decided to proactively study the language and become essentially, I don't know, fluent is quite right, but certainly near fluent. And then also to try to win over some of these hostile and rude coworkers, started doing like teaching English lessons during lunch, right? Because people might not like English speakers, but a lot of people out there admit that knowing English is a pretty handy language to know. So this person was able to win over the coworkers by doing sort of like lunch and learns and, hey, let's learn English with me, your IIT Indian male engineer. And so that, instead of just sort of retreating into his shell and just being like, oh, I'm going to do my job and get out of here. No, this person really went out of his way to engage with the country he was stationed in and engaging with the local coworkers. And then was then promoted and is currently leading, the success that this person had in this one country made senior management confident in his ability to lead similar sort of optimization projects in different countries. So at the time of applying, this person was leading change at over 10. I'm using that term very, I'm trying to be vague, but it might have been 30, might have been 10, it might have been 12, it might have been 50 in several countries, right? And the number of factories and the number of countries isn't what matters here. I think what matters here is that senior management was like, wow, you did such a good job at that one country that we sent you to, and we didn't actually expect, we didn't really know what to expect, because in the past these people have not been nice at all to foreigners. So because you did such a good job, we are now elevating you to, do even more of good stuff like that. And because no profile review would be complete without some sort of assessment of the extracurricular volunteer activity, this person really didn't have a whole lot of extracurriculars. They were sort of bouncing around internationally to different factories. It's sort of hard to commit to a particular nonprofit or cause if one is not, engaged in sort of staying in one location geographically. So this person applied to, this will come as no surprise, I think, to anyone, Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, and MIT. And so, which schools did he get into? Drum roll, please. Got into Harvard, got into Stanford, rejected from Wharton, and got into MIT. So the reason I really wanted to sort of bring up this one rejection is that I think there are some lessons to be taken from this person's profile, but also from sort of that one rejection. First of all, business school admissions can be very random, right? If I were to say to you, hey, this person got into Harvard and got into Stanford, did they get into Wharton? I think people tend to think mistakenly that it's kind of like a linear process. Like, well, of course, if they got into the number 1 school, they obviously got into the number 4 school. But I've worked with people who have applied to like 7 schools and only get into Stanford, which if you're new to this process, you may not know this, but Stanford is without a doubt the hardest school to get into. It has about a 6% acceptance rate as compared to Harvard's average of around 11. So sometimes people apply to a ton of programs and they only get into Stanford and they get rejected from Kellogg and Wharton and all the rest. I worked with someone once who was rejected from Kellogg and from UCLA, but who got into MIT. So I could sit here and spend the entire half an hour or more than that with all kinds of crazy examples just like this. But the point is, MBA admissions is not some sort of linear thing where, okay, someone gets into, let's just say, some sort of US News ranked school, the number one school, quote unquote, that person is not guaranteed to get into the number five school. So you really need to, as an applicant, cast a wide net because at a certain point, certain elements of this process are random. Or they come down to luck, or they come down to some tiny little thing or detail that the average person would never notice. And so it's not like, oh, well, I definitely got into MIT, so I'm, or, whatever. I got into Harvard, so I'm definitely getting into Wharton. No. And in fact, this person was rejected from Wharton in round one. And then I encouraged them, like, hey, why don't you just you know, try for a place like a Harvard or a Stanford. And then it worked out, which you might not think is the case. I think the lack of linearity in the process, I also want to make a point about it doesn't necessarily apply to the GMAT score. So there's this kind of mistaken assumption that I see a lot on message boards where people say something like, well, I have a 780 and I know someone with a 750 and that person got in and I didn't. And this is ridiculous. But I think you have to realize that in the eyes of admissions, it's more about a threshold being crossed. It's more at a core, right, at its very, very base level. The reason the GMAT score is useful for an admissions committee at the first level is, can this person handle the rigor and the work of our academic program? And there are lots of different ways to prove that, right? So even if this person would have had, like, say, a 720, I still think they would have gotten in. And so I think there's this idea where people say, like, well, I got a 760, so I'm automatically in better shape in the admissions process than people who got a 740. And that is not true. It is just one factor. Yes, people in more competitive cohorts, application cohorts, need the higher score because it's just a much more competitive cohort. And a lot of y'all look a lot on paper. And so they have to distinguish based on something. But please don't think like, well, I have a 770, and so therefore, presto changeo, I'm guaranteed with the wave of a magic wand to get into these amazing schools. Not necessarily. Um, and high score might be nice, but if the work experience is what stands out, that is what helps get people into these higher programs. If you want a more in-depth analysis of what I mean by some of this, you can try to find my video. It's called the AdCom Hierarchy of Needs, where I talk about why it is that strong work experience will trump a sky-high GMAT score any day. Because it's not enough to be just competent or obedient, right? Like, sure, it's great if you're good at your job, and it's great if you show up on time every day and you do as you're told, and you complete your work on time. All that's fine, but that's kind of the bare minimum for what the tippy top business schools are looking for. Because the tippy top schools, they are specifically seeking out people who have demonstrated the leadership traits that they believe are necessary for long-term success in business. And these traits have nothing to do with being good at taking a test. They have to do with things like, how do you adapt to uncertainty, right? If there's one thing this COVID thing has shown us, is that businesses all over the world in every industry are having to adapt to uncertainty, and the businesses who fail to adapt are not going to do well, even in the post-COVID age. They're looking for people who take risks, not foolish risks, but calculated, smart risks. Like, this person could have gone to this country where nobody, liked foreigners, and it could have been a huge failure, right? This person could have said, oh, yeah, send me to, France or whatever. And then, whoops, they show up, and all the French just turn up their little noses at him and don't talk to him, don't work with him. And so that could have been a risk, but it was a risk that this person took. The ability to win people over is hugely valued by business schools, especially the ability to lead without authority. So sometimes people say, well, Maria, I've never really been in charge of a project, or Maria, I don't have any direct reports, so am I in bad shape? Is it game over for me? And that's not true. You can prove leadership by winning people over. In fact, it's even more impressive if you win people over if they don't report to you. Think about it. if you're technically somebody's boss and you say to them, hey, I need you to stay until 3 a.m. and finish that whatever thing, they're going to do it because they don't want to get fired. But how much more impressive is it if that person does not report to you at all and you're able to convince them to stay until 3 o'clock in the morning to finish whatever it is, right? That's the kind of skill that people really look for. And also, anyone who has been able to drive some sort of a positive change, even or sometimes especially when it hasn't been comfortable, like when there isn't a playbook that exists, or where there isn't just sort of a paint by numbers of, well, just do step A and step B and, add a cup of sugar and bake at 400 degrees for 2 hours and boom, you're done. Like when there's no obvious recipe for success, people who are able to sort of create their own recipes for success on the fly, that is also a very highly valued trait. International experience is a big plus. It is not strictly necessary, but it certainly helps a lot, only because, first of all, the world is becoming a more global place. I know there are a lot of forces in the world right now that are fighting that, but I believe they are fighting an ultimately losing battle. I think that advances in telecommunications, I mean, hey, how many Zoom calls have we been on in the past couple months, right? Where now we can talk to people at any part of the world pretty much instantaneously. So being able to work with people with different backgrounds is going to be an increasingly important part of business success. And to the extent that different cultures might make us uncomfortable or might sort of play with our notions of power and influence, that also, the international experience helps also prove that you're able to, say, adapt to uncertainty, or to make positive change even in uncomfortable situations. Another thing that I think is important that sometimes gets lost in this is the value of humility. So I say this in particular because I see sometimes in candidates from other countries who are applying to US programs, there tends to be kind of this idea of, well, I'm applying to Stanford Business School, and Stanford Business School has only a 5.5% acceptance rate. And so, gee whiz, if I'm going to get in, I need to impress the heck out of them. Therefore, I'm going to write my resume and I'm going to write my essays about, like, the client showed so much appreciation for my work, and my boss said I was the smartest person ever, and of course I did this excellently because I do everything in an excellent way. And unfortunately, people who do that, I get it. It comes from a place that's understandable. However, people who do that also shoot themselves in the foot. So just be certain when you're writing your essays to the top schools, just because the school is competitive does not mean that they are looking for people who themselves are highly competitive, insofar as, they're not looking for people who are like, I'm going to shove my grandmother out of the way to win the prize first. No, they want people who are good at working with others, who are on some level decent human beings. And so having these accomplishments, but describing them in a way that has humility, can sometimes trip up applicants who may not be from the United States. So to sort of reiterate a point that I guess I remembered that this was on the slide and I started talking about it, and then I realized, like, oops, it's on the next slide, it's not on this slide. But just to reemphasize this, because I do think it's important, I believe that this candidate with the exact same work profile still would have gotten in to Harvard, Stanford, and MIT, even if the GMAT score would not have been over 750. Even if the GMAT score would have been 720, or honestly even 700, the story of, like, going to the other country, learning the language, winning the people, I mean, it was a great story. You guys, it made for great essay. You know how sometimes people say, like, oh, it makes for great TV. In this case, this story made for great essay. And so, you might be saying, like, oh, of course, IIT, 770, GMAT, whatever, like, psh, of course they got in. No, first of all, it's not guaranteed. And second of all, I think this person, even with a 700, would have gotten into those countries, not into those countries, into those schools, because of the experience in other countries. So I also want to point out that another thing that this person worked with me once they sort of started going through the Applicant Lab modules and realizing that their initial version of the essay was too focused on, speaking of humility, was too focused on this idea of, like, well, look at how smart I am. I'm so smart. I solved the problem. The yogurt factory was breaking down and I single-handedly solved the problem because my brain is so big. No, that's not the part you should focus on. You need for the story to focus on these positive attributes up here and not I'm the smartest person in the room and I always get appreciation from the client. Nope. So, Applicant Lab can help you avoid some of the very pitfalls I've been talking about right here and more. Applicant Lab is an online tool. It is available 24/7, so you don't need to worry about like, oh, my admissions consultant's in Los Angeles. How am I going to set up time with her? You don't have to. It's all available online. I break everything down step by step by step. I help you identify the best stories in your background, tell them in the best way, and I also have a ton of advice throughout Applicant Lab on what not to do, which sometimes is just as important as my advice on what to do. And one of the best things about Applicant Lab is that it costs less than what other admissions consultants of my caliber charge for one hour, only 1 hour of their time. And if you use GMAT Club 10 as the promo code when you check out, you actually get even more. It's actually cheaper for you. You get 10% off, so it's even more affordable. You can use Applicant Lab really quickly with or without a consultant, so you can use it alone. I give you checklists in the lab that you can ask a friend to go through and say, like, did my essay answer all the things on the checklist? You can hire me. You can use Applicant Lab and then hire me or hire someone on my team to work with you. Or, hey, use it with another consultant. If you're already working with another admissions consultant, you can use Applicant Lab and then buy a few a la carte hours from them. Or you can only buy a one school package from them and then use Applicant Lab for all of your other schools. Or if you've already purchased a multi-school package with someone else, hey, why not get sort of an insurance policy on the advice that that person is getting you? There is a tremendous amount of variability. There are some admissions consultants out there who are amazing and know very, very much what they are talking about. And there are other people out there who are frankly charlatans. And so if you're not sure which one of those you've got, why not buy Applicant Lab to double check the advice you're getting elsewhere? It's no different from, say, getting a second opinion on some sort of a medical condition or something like that. Again, GMAT Club 10 gets you 10% off. And if you've got any questions at all, please feel free to email me at support@applicantlab.com. Thank you so much and all the best for your admissions journey.